think some of you might already know Trevor, but Trevor's an architect specifier and sustainability advocate at Opsys Architecture. And really exciting for us at the AI Committee on the Environment in Oregon is he's one of our most active members, and we really appreciate him and everything he contributes to our group. So with that, I'll let you take it away, Trevor.
All right, let me adjust my screen so I can see everybody again. So I started off, and I think the genesis of this presentation was self-education as well. I wanted to understand better what the Framework for Design Excellence is. And I'm a shameless provocateur, so I threw the question to Flux to give me some image results for that. Not a particularly advanced version of an AI image generation tool. And these were 6 of the more interesting responses that it gave me. I have complex opinions on AI, and I think probably many of you do too. But I think that there's something interesting in seeing what the sort of internet zeitgeist is returning for this thing that we're trying to talk about and promote for what good design means in architecture. Obviously, it seems like there's a fair bit of infographics that it's returning back, and a lot of spaces with some wood tones and big open daylight spaces. And you know what? I don't think that's necessarily all that far from what we're trying to talk about. Whether or not I would show these to a client is a completely different question, but I think it's an interesting starting point. So there, within the Framework for Design Excellence, there are 4 outcomes that we're trying to achieve and 10 principles that get us there. And very importantly, the Framework for Design Excellence is not a rating system. It is not like LEED, doesn't provide a credential like Living Building Challenge. It is a process and a system of questions that help you to get to these 4 outcomes. So what we're trying to do here is advocate for buildings that are zero carbon, both operational and embodied carbon there. Buildings that are equitable, they're creating spaces for everyone and addressing injustices, making a better environment for all. Spaces that are resilient to change and to unknowns in the future, whether that's environmental, social, or economic. So there's a clear overlap with our sustainability goals here, obviously. And healthy. I think, you know, one of the most important things that the AIA continuing education provides are those health, safety, and welfare credits. It's part of what the license is designed to be about. And in order to be a good building, it should be a healthy building, and a big part of that will be material choices. So in order to get there, we'll go through these 10 criteria. And my approach to this presentation has been to talk about the big picture, what the title of the of each item is, which principle is, and then dive into one example of it. Because these are big picture questions, the outcomes are going to be different for every team. And I think that that can be confusing to new teams that are beginning to work on a project that's following the Framework for Design Excellence, because it's not always immediately apparent what the goal is until you go through the process. So I've heard some teams ask, is this project following the Framework for Design Excellence, and how is it doing that? And to explain that, we really have to dive back into the conversations that were had during design. What were the goals that were determined as a result of applying the Framework for Design Excellence, not assuming that it's always going to be the same outcome on every project. So what is the concept or purpose behind this project? How will the priorities within the 9 other principles inform the unique approach to this project? Each of these questions that I have on the bottom left on each of these title slides comes directly from the AIA website for Framework for Design Excellence. So there's lots more information there, as well as quite a bit more expansion on not just the questions to be asking, but some of the suggested processes of getting there. What are the design strategies that can provide multiple benefits? I think you'll see a lot of comparison here to LEED's approach for integrated design, Living Building Challenge's approach for integrated design early on, making sure that we're getting all of the right stakeholders in the right room at the right time to answer the questions appropriately. I mentioned that there's some of these direct ideas and processes that follow this. I haven't copied all of the text for all of these, but I wanted to start with the first one on design for integration. And highlight a couple of these ideas that I think can relate back to who's providing what in the project manual versus the drawings and other items. So that top one, begin collaborating early with engineers and specialty consultants, tying back to that integration piece. I think you'll hear me talk about this a lot through the presentation, but just making sure that we're getting the right people to answer the questions and not trying to invent something new when there's already a well-understood answer. Understanding who the project stakeholders are. I do work a lot in public projects. We do a lot of K-12 work, and figuring out to what extent is that going to be the users of the building, facilities, the administration, any donors that might be providing to the project outside of the normal funding process. And then I wanted to maybe draw a question mark next to the process of identifying a sustainability champion to track goals and progress. It's not that I disagree with this, but more that I think it needs to be approached carefully and with some nuance, because one pitfall that you can fall into is assigning a sustainability champion who is passionate about sustainability. Maybe they're a recent graduate, emerging professional, who just doesn't have the gravitas within the design team or speaking to a client to push back when they're hearing this is the way we've always done it, or doesn't have the construction experience to understand, well, that's a great idea, but how does it actually get detailed and built in reality, and being sensitive to those layers of additional detail. So make sure that if you are identifying a sustainability champion, it's somebody who has enough seniority to push those ideas forward and force that to be a priority for the project, the way that you're hearing from the goals discussions early on in that integrated design process. The other way that you can look at this is having everybody be responsible and obligated to achieve the sustainability goals along the way. And this can be more appropriate if you have a very large distributed team where some parts of it are too complex for one person to understand on a holistic nature. I think you just have to discuss these things early on and identify who the right person is for your specific project type, location, client, all of those things. The second is design for equitable communities. What's the project's greater reach? How are we contributing to creating a diverse, accessible, walkable, just, human-scaled community? All of these things that we'd love to have. How can we support health and resilience during times of need and emergency? And there's an interesting item that's described in the super spreadsheet. Let me back up the page. I want to address what the super spreadsheet is. I'm not going to bring it up because it would be a bunch of tiny little Excel cells that are much too small to see on a presentation screen. It's 10, 12 tabs along the bottom, each hitting each one of these categories. And the super spreadsheet was originally designed by Committee on the Environment just to talk to sustainability items, and has expanded to now also be a criteria for AIA Design Awards, and has gone through a few versions of that. There are some interesting overlaps here in terms of what it's used for as a scorecard. And I mentioned at the beginning that Framework for Design Excellence is not a scorecard. So recognizing that these are related, but not exactly the same thing. And one of those interesting overlaps is that within Design for Equitable Communities is the social cost of carbon, talking about what is the obligation to the community that we have as designers, as developers, to make sure that we're providing low carbon projects so that the cost of that carbon footprint is borne by the people who are paying for the project. This is an incredibly complicated chart that I discovered fairly recently, but I think is really interesting. What it's showing here on the left, the right-hand version is just a blown-up version of the left-hand diagram, that section that's highlighted, is the relationship between the share of global emissions by country in 2013, so this is 12 years old now, versus the share of the global social cost of carbon, the amount that those countries pay as a result of the impacts of climate change on those countries. So the more red they are, the more the more to the upper left-hand side of this graph they are, the more they are paying for the cost of climate change, and the further to the bottom they are, the more beneficial these outcomes are. So I'll pick on a few examples to make this a little less abstract. Russia in this chart is below that -1 to 4 line. They're actually experiencing economic growth as a result of climate change. They're seeing not a cost, but a benefit to climate change. And that's the case for all of those countries that are in blue. Anything that's in red, but below the 1 to 1 line is contributing and also paying for, but at a lower rate than their contribution. So the United States is just a little below that 1 to 1 line. And then we have countries like India that are in the top that are contributing to global emissions, yes, but the amount that they're paying as a result of those changes is far exceeding their actual contribution. So they are suffering from the results of climate change much more. The actual global social cost of carbon has been very hotly debated for a long time. It was $3 for a while in the US. Then California adopted a $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent standard. It was $51 for a bit from at the federal level, and the EPA under the Biden administration recommended $190. Obviously, with the current administration moving in a different direction of not addressing those, that $190 is more in line with European recommendations at the moment. But I think understanding whether, regardless of where you fall in that number, the relationship of who is bearing the cost based on this chart, I think is pretty sobering. The third principle here is design for ecosystems. So how are we designing to support the ecological health of a place over time, not just the plant life, but the biological health of all species that are using that particular area as habitat, including the humans that live there, including things like supporting equitable access to nature. So the image here is our pilot project at the zoo. And my recommendation for the deep dive portion on this is to rely on the experts. We already have really good information and rating systems like Declare, like FSC for responsible wood sourcing. The little bird icon there was to remind me to talk about bird-safe glazing, which is something that we can include in the specification specifically without necessarily changing the overall design of a building, although you can do that in design as well. And recognize that architects are just not industrial hygienists, and we aren't chemists, and the difference between one chemical and another that sounds very similar can be wildly different from a perspective of health, durability, availability, cost, all of these other things. Don't try and reinvent that. That's not what we were trained on. We don't know what we're talking about. But there are people who are very close to our industry who do know these things deeply and are continuing to work on them. And even in that group, there are so many tens of thousands of chemicals, individual chemicals that can be reviewed, that programs like Declare are looking at these within buckets. So within a bucket of orthophthalates or chlorinated polyvinyl chlorides, or whatever this larger term will be, saying, hey, we know that this product is the worst in class option for this particular building product, and so therefore it's on the red list. And this can make it really easy for us to just exclude those products as a category. I say easy in terms of describing it. It's certainly not easy. It's a lot of legwork to do the research and make sure that we're avoiding those things. And in many cases, there are no appropriate alternatives. I'll cherry pick another example of neoprene pads for mechanical units that are resting on a rooftop. There's not a very good alternative for that as a product right now. Therefore, there are exceptions within these programs that say, we understand that this is the only product that meets this particular criteria for a building. So it shouldn't necessarily be scary to try and adopt items like Declare as a general process for your projects. We could go down a whole rabbit hole for FSC as well, but I'll leave it there as my recommendation is if you can find products that are FSC 100%, that is always going to be the best option. Finding those things locally is also going to speak to the learning objective at the very top of promoting wellness in terms of supply chain and reducing slavery in the supply chain, to be quite frank, because we have so much more information about what's happening when we're specifying products locally as opposed to internationally, where that documentation may be more difficult to achieve. You can do it. You can do that legwork, and you should if you need to get this from somewhere else. But if you can, sourcing locally is always a good idea. Design for water. So how are we using water wisely, addressing efficiency and consumption while matching water quality to appropriate use? I find water as a conservation topic really interesting because it depends, again, so intimately on the local microsystem of the hydrological cycle of the area that you're living in, or designing for rather. Here I work in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, like I assume most of you do as well. And we get a tremendous amount of water during the winter. And maybe we might not think about this as much as somebody who's designing in Arizona, but I think it's still something to understand and recognize. When is that water being applied? How much is it being rejuvenating the water cycle in your local geology? And what can we do to address that appropriately here for our specific climate? I made this cheeky little redacted for COTE slide on here because this was originally a slide that had a list of a variety of our engineering partners that we're working for here directly at OPSIS. But that was not the point to promote specific engineers. My point of this slide was, again, to rely on the experts. These are the people who understand how to spec those mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems that are going to be responsive to this, or your landscape engineers, landscape architects, civil engineers who are working to help you manage the stormwater on the site more broadly. These are the people who have the deep expertise needed to address this particular topic. And so I think those are the people that we need to raise those topics and questions to early on and ask them, how are you achieving these goals for Framework for Design Excellence? What are you doing to support this in the project? And how is it working within all of the other criteria that you're also designing around? Design for economy. How do we provide abundance while living within our means? I know value engineering can often be a very painful process during our design phases, but it is something that's important to consider when we're looking at what makes a good project. A project that overruns its costs 2 and 3 times is not being responsible to our clients or necessarily to future projects that could be using those dollars to their highest and best value. So how are you designing first cost with long-term value? How can the performance of this project be improved in ways that are cost and design neutral? And I want to talk about that design neutral piece with regards to the specifications, which is to say, stop sole sourcing. Don't do it. I, again, work mostly in public projects, so this is something that we have to deal with on a regular basis, but we also do projects that are not public and are not as beholden to this requirement as a project using public bidding procedures might be. In Oregon, sole source specifications for publicly bid projects are prohibited by law, and they cost more. But there's a whole bunch of exceptions to that I want to touch on slightly here. Highly restrictive specifications that exclude competition is still sole sourcing, even if you include language that says something to the effect of substitutions permitted, XYZ, as approved by architect. Whatever weasel language you want to include doesn't change the fact that if you write a specification where only one manufacturer could meet those requirements, that is still a sole source. I think oftentimes we don't see this happen, or we don't see the result of this because you would only receive feedback on doing this incorrectly if a manufacturer protests that at the time of the bid award, which I have seen happen for a few products that I won't name, but most of the time it doesn't. There are some exceptions based on dollar value, and these need to be submitted by the owner. So again, another level of separation from what we may be designing on the architectural design side. For things that are under $25,000, there's a small procurement process. You don't actually have to go through anything. Those are totally fine to sole source, but you probably don't want to, again, for the purpose of creating a competitive bid environment. If there's another product that is equivalent, try and include both of those. It is more work for us to review that, for sure. But if you can, I would recommend it for the benefit of the project and finding those dollars, frankly, to use on something that's more interesting to your design than just having not done the research in the first place. For that mid-range $25,000 to $250,000, the owner just has to submit a letter of findings saying, hey, this is valuable to us. That might come up for a variety of things. I've seen it happen quite often for things like elevators or building control systems, lighting controls, where the owner has a vested interest in staying within a specific system. An access control security system, similarly, where they don't have to manage 4 different manufacturers that don't speak to each other. They just want to have one for their whole campus. That's a legitimate reason to do this sole source process, but it needs to come from the owner, not from the design team. If it's a very expensive item, like it might be for one of those systems, not only do they have to document those findings, but they actually have to get approval from the state. So it can be a whole process, and I think oftentimes there's just not awareness that this is a thing that needs to be done, or there's an assumption that because it was done on a previous project, it's going to apply to this one. It's just a conversation to have with the owner ahead of time and what their expectations are. Moving into design for energy, I think this is one that's very familiar to most of us in terms of what we're trying to do to reduce the operational energy use of the project. And there's a lot that we could talk about in terms of how far you can go with modeling versus how many things can will end up being controlled by the operational uses of the client or the stakeholders, the building users in the future that you can't necessarily predict. And the weather might be different, so your model might be wrong based on that. But there are a few things that we can zero in on here. In this particular one, I wanted to grab an example that I've seen be an issue for quite a few design teams, which is specifying the U values of glazing storefront units. The glazing is the glass portion. The framing that's around the outside is not glazing. And I mean, we could get into the semantics of this for sure. But what I see a lot of teams doing is picking an insulated glazing unit. We're often looking at the charts from, say, Vitro that give us an example of if you're using, their SolarBand 70 product with a clear plus a clear light on the inside and inboard and outboard lights, then you're going to receive this 0.28 highlighted value for your U value, which is exceeding Oregon's requirement for zone 4 of a 0.36 U value. And that seems like, hey, we've got some good wiggle room there. But when you actually get into this, if you've selected one of the lower performing options for the actual storefront framing, and say it's 85% of that opening for the storefront system, if you follow this complex chart from that 85%, following this little red dash line up to where it hits the highlight for the 0.28 U value for the glazing, and you follow that back over on this chart, you see that this is actually a 0.37 U value, which is not compliant with energy code, prescriptive energy code. Again, that's a whole other thing. So make sure that if you are writing the minimum spec values based on the prescriptive code requirements in the energy code, that you're talking about it as a whole assembly and not just the glazing piece itself, which might, in this example, again, be well below the prescriptive requirement, but as a system, it's not. Moving into design for well-being. How can the design encourage a healthy lifestyle? How can we provide better occupant comfort? Here I want to jump back into the super spreadsheet a little bit more. So actually that's the next one. But this is something that is on the super spreadsheet, talking about interior air quality. One of the things I've been recommending to quite a few clients is to have, especially for remodel projects where the building is occupied during construction, is to have these interior air quality monitors continuously in the site during the whole construction phase. This example is taken from our own office over the last several months. And it's giving us responses back on all sorts of different criteria. So starting at the top, it's giving us that 1.1 picocuries per liter for radon, which is well below the action threshold of 4. So we're looking pretty good from a radon perspective. The PM1 and PM2.5 just below that, the particulate I was interested to see if we were going to have any spikes on that based on wildfire smoke, but we didn't have too bad of a wildfire season as far as smoke in our area of Portland, so I didn't see any big spikes there. We are seeing a little bit of those yellow zones happening on our VOC content during the day, and I think we can best describe that to our deliveries of product samples into the office. And those tend to be spiking a little bit more in the evenings when the unoccupied times where our air exchanges are lower, as opposed to during the day when we're all in the office. CO2 is specifically called out as an item for design on the Design Excellence Awards. I saw when I was reviewing these 2 years ago, the Design Excellence Awards as one of the jurors. Most of the mechanical engineers were claiming that they were targeting between 800 and 1,000 parts per million of CO2, which is a pretty typical number. To give that a little bit of context, the pre-industrial content of CO2 in the atmosphere, this is before the Industrial Revolution in the United States, was around 280 parts per million CO2 in outdoor air. So you will never get below that because we're replacing this indoor air with outdoor air. So any level that's our background value for outdoor air, if that's what we're bringing in, that's our floor for how low we can get this number. When I originally wrote this presentation, the value was around 420 parts per million. And the last time I checked, it was closer to 428 parts per million. This is just after a few months of writing some notes on this. So those numbers are moving up in the background quite quickly and in a very concerning way. And since we can't ever design below that threshold by replacing outdoor air, it's quite concerning. Above 1,000, you start to get complaints of sleepiness from building occupants. So definitely want to stay below that. Above 2,000 parts per million, you start to have people experiencing headaches, lack of attention, and above 5,000 parts per million is death after a short period of time. And Amanda, I see your question, and in lieu of plugging a specific brand, I will respond to directly on that if anybody else is curious which particular version this is. The intent was not to use a professional version because we wanted to keep the cost low. So this particular one was about $250, $300. So not a huge lift to get to part of a project design budget if you want to give the owner some peace of mind that the space that they're inhabiting while construction is happening is safe. Going back beyond what this chart was showing, we were seeing some really concerning spikes in VOCs during the renovation of our office. And we tried to hunt down what those things were because we had done a lot of work to make sure that we were specifying low VOC paints and adhesives and carpets, and it was still spiking during the day. So I think it really gives us a reality check of, are the things that we're specifying actually resulting in that safer outcome within the space? And you know, if it's not, is it because of a mistake in the spec? Is it somebody brought something on site they shouldn't have? Is it just a temporary thing that you can flush out and have it be fine by the time you're occupying the space? I think those are all really valuable questions to be asking. Within design for resources, I think this is the one where I'm getting back into the super spreadsheet. There are a lot of questions within that. I'll go to the example here. That are things that can be specifically specified. So numbers of EPDs, environmental product declarations that you're providing for the project. A percentage of construction waste that is diverted is obviously its own spec section that can be its little standalone. Total cost of materials for recycled, regional, I was mentioning buying locally before, reused and salvaged materials, bio-based materials, which we're seeing come up more frequently for federal projects that are trying to meet those requirements for the USDA bio-based requirement, and FSC wood. A lot of these get into a little bit more of how these end up within the spec, but I think these are areas where we can specifically set goals early and have them be quite clear in terms of what the goals are in a spec for a project. Design for change is always really hard to talk about because I think you have to define what that change will be, and knowing that that change could be unanticipated. But what types of things might you want to consider for social, economic, and environmental change? An easy one is to assume that the weather will be warmer than it was before. But what does that mean for your actual design? Is it that there's going to be more of a focus on active cooling or some other process? These are the questions to ask of the design team, and the answer might be different based on the actual project that you're working on. Within passive survivability and livability, I think there are some additional topics that we could hit on as far as resilience there. I did want to highlight that one in particular because I heard just this morning that the governor signed a mandate for public buildings to be seismically retrofit, as opposed to in the past, many of those options were voluntary. So take a look at that. That may affect your public projects if you weren't aware of that. That was signed just this morning. Design for discovery. How can we how can the design process foster a long-term relationship between designers, users, and operators to ensure design intentions are realized and building performance can improve over time? And I really like that idea of improving building performance over time. One of the topics that comes up in the design for energy conversations a lot is whether electrification makes sense right now based on the particular energy mix that's coming from the grid. And in Oregon, it's already a fairly clean grid, depending on exactly which jurisdiction you're in. But it's certainly much more clean than any site-based fossil fuel mechanical systems that are available. But is that going to be true in the future? What's that energy mix going to look like? I think we can make some predictions on those based on the commitments that the various states and PUCs and utilities have made together to understand what we should be expecting for that future performance over time. And that is kind of where I wanted to leave the overall comment on the 10 sections of the framework for design excellence. There's another section of this after this that I'll get into a little bit more specifically on specifications. If you have questions, feel free to put those into the chat, and I'll try and answer those as we're going, or Kathy can interrupt me. And the other thing I had in my notes about the design for discovery is related to the post-occupancy evaluations, which I think can be really challenging to make sure that we are getting good, valuable information to us. There's sort of two camps here. One is to have the post-occupancy evaluation be consistent project to project to project to project so that we're able to compare them and see how we're doing better or differently. But I think all projects have an element of uniqueness to them that resists a formalized standard approach. And so it can be really hard to ask the same question and get a valuable answer from it. So I think you just need to balance, are you asking a question that is going to get you a consistent answer that you can compare to a past project? Or are you asking questions in those post-occupancy evaluations that are tailored specifically to that project, client, process to understand what that might do on a more subjective level moving forward? So I think a lot of those are just questions to, again, ask at the beginning and document, and then include the process of that in the overall narrative if you're going for a design excellence award. A lot of the submissions that I saw as a juror had a big impact on from marketing language, where it felt like they were reading the framework design categories and applying a description without it saying how it actually influenced the design, which I think is a less compelling argument than saying that you engaged with the questions and came to maybe a surprising outcome or a different design direction than one would normally have expected, and show through that process of conversation how the design was changed specifically for that. I think that's a great argument for excellence. All right. On the specification side, there has been a larger conversation within the OPSIS office about spec writing, and I'm not going to get deep into that, but I think there's some value to talking about what are specs. I know for a lot of emerging professionals, They may not have ever opened a project manual in their careers. And even for a lot of project architects, they may not be reading it in a thorough and valuable way that helps them to understand what they're requiring of a contractor. And I think that's a problem. I think there's a tremendous value to providing the 4 C's from CSI, for those of you who've gone through that process, the clear, concise, correct, and complete, to make sure that we're getting all of the information that we need to in the spec in a way that is understandable to the people that we're writing it to. So of course, from a contractual standpoint, we're writing it directly to the general contractor. But from a broader perspective, the individual sections are being shared with trade partners, installers, who have a variety of different levels of education and literacy. And we want to make sure that everyone can read it, because it is the expectation that they are reading it and accurately providing those things within the project. So, we've got our front end up in the top left of this oval here of procurement and contracting and general requirements that are often being provided to us by the owner. And these set the tone for all of the requirements that we're writing thereafter. And so it's so crucial that we get these things early enough in the design process that we can read them, make modifications where necessary, even if those have to go through difficult legal conversations with counsel, to understand that what we're providing is industry standard where possible and modified where necessary to meet the requirements for the overall project success. Moving into the sort of bottom section, these divisions 2 through 14 are often the ones that are going to be most closely written and reviewed by the design team, whether a project architect on the team or a separate spec writer from another office that's consulting. Whoever is doing this is producing these sections text in the bulk. And there's going to be some review. I've highlighted the concrete, masonry, and metal sections, of course, from our structural engineers. There's going to be some review of these thermal and moisture protection sections and openings from our building envelope consultants, if you're lucky enough to have one on a project. And I think they do fantastic work, so you should. And because we know that moisture infiltration is the #1 source of litigation in the industry. So having a good direction that we can lean back on and say, this is what the experts recommended to us, is always really valuable. And then we have this whole section up here in the upper right, all of these sections in the 20s and 30s that are coming from our MEP, civil and landscape consultants, and many others that are mostly written by them and very lightly reviewed by the design team, and could have some major implications for consistency between those sections. So just recognizing that when we're talking about spec consistency, the architecture team may only be touching a small section of those, and we're getting those and aggregating them from quite a variety of people on the design team and trying to push consistency. So again, having a simple way to describe that is so valuable. So what are we trying to achieve in this conversation, specifically with specifications and framework for design excellence? I'm actually not talking about any of these rating systems, which are fantastic, and if you're using them, you should keep using them. We're not talking about LEED, Living Building Challenge, WELL, Passive House, or Green Globes, or any of the other rating systems that exist out there. I think there's a lot of really useful information out there about how to incorporate these into your specifications, and I'm not trying to reproduce that here. What we're trying to talk about more so is how to raise the floor for the worst building that your office could possibly design, which I hope is better than code minimum. But even if it is code minimum, I think there's some levels of things where we can move towards saying, hey, we want to achieve these additional goals above and beyond that. So how do we do that? Again, to steal a line from CSI, say it once, say it right. We want to put any repetitive requirements that we can in our Division 1 overall sections so that we can have those clear, concise, correct, and complete architectural sections beyond where we're picking our products. So in this example, if we have a really robust VOC content restrictions section, maybe we're referencing the SCAQMD rules 1113 and 1168 for paints, coatings, and joint sealants, and all of those things. Or or federal requirements, CARB, whatever you're happening to go for. If we have that strong list there, referencing an industry standard, again, coming back to my point that I was harping on before, relying on the experts, the people who are updating these things regularly, whose jobs it is to review and understand what the standards that should apply are. ASTM standards, for example. If we can refer back to a standards agency without reinventing the wheel, let's do that. It's so much more straightforward, and we can always go to the most current information if it's changing, which it's going to, because we're learning more about these things all the time. Then within the individual sections, whether that's painting or joint sealants or carpets, which will have adhesives likely, we can refer back to this overall section in Division 1, and instead of repeating all of our VOC content restrictions and saying, for this type of paint, you need to hit this topic, for this other type of paint, you need to hit a different target, we can just look at the original standard that has everything in it all together, and do it once and do it right. And there's many things that this will apply to. So this table of contents taken from a project that I worked on recently, highlighting a few of those big ticket items in Division 1, where we can set the stage for success in all of the future sections. I don't know if you can read any of these on screen, so I'm going to highlight the ones that I can pick out, starting from the first highlight, which is substitution procedures. Coming back to that idea of sole specifying, making sure that we are providing appropriate methods and processes for the contractor to follow, so that they understand and we understand what the requirements are when substituting a different product. I'll give an example here where if you are reaching for, say, 10 declare labels on a project, one way that you can give the contractor some leeway to understand supply chain issues that may happen is to say, we've picked out 10 products that have declare labels, and we've listed those out in our finishing materials legend, and here's what they are. Those are our basis of design products. But if you want to supply a different product that meets all of the other criteria, you can do that if you give us another declare label for another product that we didn't identify. And so that's not necessarily putting more work onto the contractor at the start, because they can just provide the basis of design product. But it gives them that flexibility to pick and choose the items that make the most sense. I've seen this used also for FSC criteria, saying, hey, 75% of the building's wood by cost needs to be FSC, whatever certification level that is. But if you can't achieve it in, say, the engineered trusses or casework, which might be more difficult to do, you can pick it up in some other section. You just need to pick and choose which of those makes the most sense. Project management and coordination, submittal procedures. These are sections that came from the owner in this project, and we needed to review those and make sure that they were saying things that were using the same terminology that we wanted to use to maintain the sustainability goals of the project. I talked about the VOC content restriction already. Construction waste management, indoor air quality are typical ones that you'll see most of the time, but I think, again, great to review. And then whether or not you're doing any sort of rating system that we're mentioning before, I think it is valuable to have a section in Division 1 that is sustainable design reporting that clearly outlines what are the goals for this project and what is the contractor's responsibility to certify that that is happening. I think on every single project I have ever worked on, I have had a contractor ask me, is this a LEED project, regardless of what we said all over the drawings and the specifications. And it's not that they don't know or haven't read these things, it's that there will be one throwaway line somewhere in the spec that says some reference to LEED or something to that effect. Some certification that may also be in LEED, like construction waste management. But clearly outlining, here's what we want, here's how you do that. That's the right place to do that. That's the right place to define where what an EPD is, if you're requiring it to be third-party verified or some other system. It's the right place to define when you say sustainable wood as a requirement for a section. What do you mean by that? Do you mean only FSC? Do you mean it can be SFI or PEFC or any of these other rating systems? What's the criteria for that? And then you don't have to repeat that in all those later sections. You can make those sections nice and clean and tight and refer back just to the Division 1 section. Which gets to my point here, again, slightly provocative. The product selection is not the responsibility of the specifier. And I think, again, it can't be. And why can't it be? Because the specifier doesn't know everything that the design team is picking for. We can include all of those requirements in the spec. It can be a responsibility of the specifier to uphold these design values and these design criteria that you're selecting for. But we can't be the original source of it because we don't know why you picked it. What did you put in the drawings? Does it conform with the way that we're describing it in the spec? Where is it coming from? Is it available with these criteria of, leads 500-mile radius, or, an example of this that I ran into with wood recently is we had a blanket FSC requirement, but we had picked a product and species and manufacturer that simply couldn't provide all of those things in FSC. They could provide FSC and they could provide that particular wood species, but they couldn't provide all of the things we've done together in one to do that. So you do have to do some of the legwork to understand what's available and what requirements we can put into the spec. And that is the design team's obligation. So let's do an example of this as I'm running towards the end of time here. Again, feel free to put the questions in the chat. Let's say you just recently read the Carbon Leadership Forum's policy toolkit on embodied carbon accounting for materials on EPDs, and you're fired up and you're like, man, I really want to get low carbon concrete into my project. Great. So first, let's set a roadmap for how to do that, coming back to putting something in Division 1 that defines what an EPD is. Now we want to go into the cast in place concrete section and say, okay, one of your submittal requirements is to provide an EPD. But what's the target? Is this something where we have a fixed number that we're going towards based on CLF's recommendations? And how is the contractor going to prove this? There are plenty of concrete suppliers around Oregon that don't have EPDs. If you're working in Portland, there's a phenomenal wealth of EPDs on concrete, so you will have many to pick from. But if you're out in rural Oregon, that may not be the case. So how does the contractor prove it? And there might be some alternative paths for that again. So then if it needs to be a submittal, is it part of the product data, or is sustainability documentation something that's happening on a parallel and separate path? Does it need to be approved in order for them to procure and move forward? Or is this just informational, like it might be for maintenance requirements or other closeout documents like MSDS that we wouldn't necessarily directly review? And both of those might be appropriate paths based on the goal of the project. So then, are you trying to track all of these for the whole building, or are you limiting this just to concrete? Trying to do whole building accounting can be overwhelming because there's so many different things and levels of disclosure that's available, or are you just picking concrete and steel and aluminum and glass and these things that have robust EPDs and are the major drivers of embodied carbon in the project? That's I think a question to consider as an overall team. And then who's going to track it? Do they have the right information? Is the right information available? Are you asking the right person? One of the challenges that I've seen on trying to do this in the past is asking for cost information at the time of product data for tracking overall sustainability of projects, going back to that super spreadsheet example where it's asking for the cost of each of these line items. You might not have that until the end of the project, so it can be very difficult to have that as an approval gate through a product data submittal. So do what you can without rocking the boat so much that it impacts the project's ability to be completed, because if we create negative experiences for sustainability goals with contractors and owners, they're less likely to do more of that in the future. I just wanted to get into an example of this using some specific submittal language. I don't want you to take away to use this exact submittal language. The point that I wanted to highlight is more related to having this individual section under submittals that's for sustainable design documentation. And in the example of concrete, our path was to say, we either wanted EPDs that prove that it's 10% below the CLF baseline, which was described in the concrete section itself, or if they can't do that, provide these supplemental cementitious materials, slag, fly ash, other pozzolans, that we know can achieve that based on EPDs that were available to us from other Portland area manufacturers. So we know these things move us in the right direction, and if we set some reasonable goals for what those are, we can with fair confidence say that it probably would have been below that embodied carbon level that we're targeting, even if we don't have that data available to us. It can sometimes be uncomfortable for people to move forward without that fixed idea that things are exactly what they should be. But I think sometimes that's the world we live in. There's a bit of uncertainty there, and it's valuable to do what we can. With that, I think I'm at the very end of time. If anyone wants to jump in, come off mute, and ask a question, feel free. Otherwise, thanks for listening to me for an hour, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much, Trevor. That was fantastic. Does the group have any questions before we close up?
Did you address the air quality monitor question? I missed it if you did.
Not directly. I didn't want to make a product plug as part of the overall recommendation, but there's quite a few out there. There are not a ton that do all of the things together, including radon and PM1, PM2.5. But I think it's, I wouldn't necessarily lean on one in particular. I would say find something that's hitting the goals that you want to track for your project. I think that those dust particulate and VOC ones are really valuable for redesign projects where you're occupying the space. So you can put one maybe in the construction zone, one outside of the construction zone if you wanted, compare how those things are different. Or you can use them as a backstop to allow the contractor to not have to do some of those really onerous flush out requirements that might not be in alignment with the project's schedule. I think a lot of times those just get skipped. Nobody's there to enforce it, even if it's contractually required, they just don't do it. So having some data that can back up and say, we didn't do this, but look, the air is fine, is a useful thing to know. Or, conversely, to look at it and say, like, hey, you didn't do this, and the air quality is really bad, and I don't feel comfortable letting people in this building until it's flushed out. That's, I think, another thing that can just give you that confidence to move forward.
Trevor, do you have any examples of how, let's say there's an innovative product, the owner loves it, you love it, it checks all the boxes, it's red list free, FSC, everything. They're the only manufacturer who makes it. Mm-hmm. How do you handle the sole sourcing requirement in that case? Yeah,
I think the first question is, could it be produced by somebody else? And they just aren't doing it, because if there is that opportunity for market expansion, I think that's valuable. It can also be falling within that realm of not hitting the thresholds that are necessary to do any sort of major documentation, if that's an option. And I think it may be an option to provide that as the baseline. And like with that FSC option that I was giving of providing a percentage target for the overall project, you can tie that into an overall goal where you're trying to hit some level of these things, maybe it's living products, maybe you selected something that has a living product challenge and you really want that. You could say, we want this living product, it's the only thing that can be made using this type. But if we can't provide that for some reason, and it needs to go to another option, here's an alternative that's not hitting that, and you need to find a way to provide us a different living product that's achieving the same idea somewhere else. I think and sometimes it may be realizing that on certain public projects, certain clients, it's just not the right time to go for a really unusual product, which can be disappointing. But we can put as much information and as many fallback options as possible and see if we can get buy-in from everybody along the way. And this is all assuming that it's a hard bid, design bid build, project, if you're going to this through a progressive design or a general contractor's construction manager type of delivery system, I think you have more opportunity to discuss with the contractor if it's going to be a product that they have experience and think that they experience with and can get at a reasonable price, and maybe it's a non-issue in the first place. It would already have been the cheapest option for what you're doing.
Thanks.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we can call it. Thank you very much, Trevor, for this. It was a great presentation. We appreciate the work going into it.
Yeah, thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.